Clear and convincing evidence. Those are the words of United Nations weapons inspectors whose report verifies what it seems most of the world already knew, that chemical weapons have indeed been used on a wide scale inside Syria. And while the report does constitute the first official word from the international body confirming the attacks, the report stops short of saying who has ultimately been responsible for that attack. Joining us now is former Canadian ambassador to the UN, Paul Heinbecker. And Paul is in our Ottawa studios. We thank you for taking time to speak with us today, sir.
Thank you.
This report was not entitled to say who was responsible, but can we draw any conclusions from it that would indicate who is actually responsible?
Well, you can, in the sense that it was a very sophisticated attack. It was an attack on several areas at once, several different weapons. Kind of weapons that, according to Human Rights Watch, which did its own report, were known and documented to be held only by the Syrian government. But nonetheless, you know, the UN Security Council has asked the Secretary General to find out only whether chemical weapons were used. The Russians were very careful to protect their client state, Syria, and its administration, the Assad government, from being found responsible. So now the next part of the game is to create a UN Security Council resolution which authorizes the weapons inspections and the removal of the materials and the destruction of them. And that also will be done under the protective eye of Russia to ensure that the Assad government is not adversely affected by it.
That's asking for no small amount of trust from the international community. I mean, as you said, Russia is basically in cahoots with Syria in most respects. So why should we trust them to believe that this is actually going to be something that's done above board?
Well, I think there are actually two reasons, and they give me some hope and comfort. The first is that the Russians don't like chemical weapons either. They're party to a convention to get rid of chemical weapons. Canada has actually been helping them do that over the years. And they themselves have gotten rid of tens of thousands of tons of chemical weapons, as have the Americans. And by the way, even the Syrian allies, the Iranians, don't like chemical weapons either. They were the last country to be subject to chemical weapons by Saddam Hussein in the 80s. So the second reason why I have some hope for it is that the Russian credibility is now at stake. Putin has put himself front and center, and the obligation on him now is to deliver. And the world will be watching. So I think there's some reason for hope here. On the other hand, there's not much doubt that Assad will try to cheat, and that we will see plenty of difficulties for the weapons inspectors in the months ahead.
Mr. Heinbecker, you just used the word obligation, and I wanted to touch on that for a second. The West, based on the charter that governs the usage or non-usage of chemical weapons, puts the West in a position of obligation. If those weapons are used, they are obligated to do something about it. And we haven't seen anything done about that. Will we see something done about the usage of chemical weapons?
Well, the good news in the UN finding is that now there is no doubt, not even the skeptics, not the people who believe that Armstrong didn't step on the moon or that Obama was born in Africa. None of those people, however skeptical they may be, can now take the view that an impartial international commission has found that the weapons were used. Now comes the obligation part. The first part of the obligation is to get rid of the weapons, is to bring them under control, and that's the process that's underway. The second part of the obligation, in my judgment at least, is to bring the perpetrators to justice. That's going to be a tall order. The Russian-American agreement says nothing about the International Criminal Court. That's one way you would bring the perpetrators to justice. And there's also nothing in the likely UN resolution that's going to authorize the use of force if Assad does not comply. So if it turns out that he really is seriously cheating and is not complying, it's going to take a decision by the international community to work around the UN Security Council and to do something about it more directly. But you've seen how little appetite there is for that in the US Congress.
Sir, this chemical weapons report is obviously front and center today for us in the media, but there is a much larger issue of the ongoing civil situation in Syria and what the West is going to do about that. I mean, it hasn't, I guess, petered out by any stretch of the imagination. Is that what the West is sitting back waiting for this situation in Syria to solve itself?
I think you know, there's a kind of grand bargain in play here, and that is Assad gets to keep his head and his power, and the international community gets to get rid of his chemical weapons. But that leaves, as you said, the civil war entirely unaffected, or almost entirely unaffected. And Syrians continue to die, if not wholesale by chemical weapons, at least retail by bombs and bullets and shells and so on. And the international community, I think, has basically turned a blind eye. And, you know, we said never again after the Holocaust. We said never again after the Rwandan genocide. Now we're in the middle of a conflict which is over 100,000 dead, people dying by the scores daily and weekly. We have 2 million people who are refugees. Half of those are children. Another 4 million displaced inside Syria. We can't say we didn't know it was happening, but we seem to hope that somehow, if we let this play out somehow, we will be relieved of our obligation to do something about it.
Well, Mr. Heinbecker, and I appreciate you taking time. I'm going to ask you one more question here. Is this not then the West basically offering tacit approval for the continuing purge of his own country by Bashar al-Assad? If we sit back, idly back, and do nothing except author a report which say, hey, chemical weapons were used, but you can still go on and kill your own people as long as you don't gas them.
That's one of the not very obvious conclusions one can reach, and that is that this is, in some sense, condones Assad's behavior in the civil war. That's something that's pretty tough to live with from a conscience point of view.
No question about that. Sir, I appreciate you taking time to talk with us today.
Thank you.
That was Paul Heinbecker, a former Canadian ambassador to the UN, and he joined us from Ottawa.